Mastin, who is a lifelong resident of Canadice. He was a school teacher for some time in the town of Richmond. He was the town supervisor of Canadice for 14 years, and he's a regular contributor to the Canadice Chronicles. This is Earl. Second is Barbara Outhouse, Barbara Preston Outhouse, who is a member of the famous Preston family, longtime residents of Canadice. And her father farmed on County Road 37. And I have a message from your school teacher, Marion Sutton, who taught schoolhouse number 3, which is now, I think, just a little pile of rubble on the corner of Holmes Road and County Road 37. And Marion Sutton was not able to make it here tonight, but she sends her best, and she's the one that suggested that you, as her former pupil, would be able to talk about the town. And last but not least is Jack Evans, and first I have to say that Jack is the person who was letting us use the classroom in the old Hemlock High School, which he has bought and kind of renovated and keeps going for the community. And we want to thank Jack for that. I'm sorry we couldn't have it there, but with a crowd like this, we didn't want to turn people away. Jack was an early resident of Hemlock. His father was a railroad worker, and I think he has a lot of stories to tell us about Hemlock Lake and the Hemlock Fair. And Jack is now a businessman. He owns and runs Velmex in Bloomfield. Okay. For tonight, for our great location tonight, we really want to thank the Hemlock Fire Department, particularly Harry Rapley, for suggesting and letting us use this and helping us get it together. Right. Okay, so we'll let the show begin. Earl?
Good evening, folks. Good evening. It's nice to see such a large gathering here for the meeting, and that's always encouraging. I hope you don't get disappointed. One of the reasons why I was asked, I suppose, to speak here tonight was because I was a resident of the town of Canadice all my life. I can give you a little introduction, or maybe it turned out to be more than I would like to. I was born in the town of Canadice 84 years ago, and I live in the same house where I was born at that time. A little about my family. I was one of 7 children in the family. All of us attended the little district school near our home. It was better known as the Gulf Schoolhouse. Back of the schoolhouse was a stream, or a gully, if you want to call it, which ran through the woods and was the source of our drinking supply, the water. I never knew of anybody getting sick drinking the water out of the creek. Of course, nowadays some people would get sick even thinking of it. I attended the little district school through the grades. From there, I went to Honeoye High School. My next older brother and my older sister and myself drove a horse and buggy to Honeoye to school the first 2 years. The last 2 years, we drove a 1917 Model T touring car. After graduating from Honeoye High School, I stayed out of school 1 year and helped my father on the farm, and also helped him in the Canadice telephone company. This, over the years, had been neglected, the wires and the poles, and they'd hired Dad and me for helper to help to restore some of the bad lines and set up new poles. Of course, this was through the winter. We drove a horse and buggy all over town that winter, some pretty cold days. It was my job to dig the holes through the frozen ground for setting the poles and rolling up some of the wire that was no more in use at that time. After the winter passed, in the spring, I started to work and May 13th. I remember it because it's my sister's birthday. Started work for Harwell Hayward on the farm. I worked there on the farm until September. Worked Labor Day. The next day, I went to teacher's training class in Canadice.
Earl,
Yes.
excuse me. We graybeards back here are having some trouble hearing you. Do you think you could speak up a little louder?
I'll try.
Or how could we manage? There's a microphone. Isn't there a microphone?
Microphone here.
It's not projected.
It doesn't work that way. It's just for recording. The microphone is on.
I'll try to speak a little louder.
All right. Project.
Maybe if I come a little closer.
Sure.
Might possibly help. Maybe this will help a little.
Right out in the open.
You're right out here.
Right. Great.
So after graduating from the teacher's training class, I taught school in the home district 1 year. After that, I went to Geneseo State Normal, where I received a certificate to teach a life certificate. I taught 10 years, and the last year was 1942. I was teaching the 7th and 8th grade in Honeoye. Uncle Sam extended me an invitation to the military. I was, I don't know if it's called it fortunate or not, but at any rate, the draft board saw fit to defer me until that school year was out, provided that I wouldn't take a contract for another year. So that more or less finished my teaching career. I had some trouble remembering what I want to say. Sometimes I have a mental block. And there's some older people in the crowd probably appreciate the way I feel. At any rate, after teaching the 10 years, and forced to give up the teaching, I worked at farming, trucking, and other occupations for a few years. A time came when I was elected supervisor of the town of Canadice, and I served as the supervisor for 14 years. And I guess probably I've told you enough about my background, and we'll go on and talk some about the town of Canadice. My memory fails me, like I mentioned, so to be sure of myself, I wrote down what I would like to say, and you'll have to pardon me for reading. The town of Canadice was formed from the town of Richmond in 1829. In 1835, the southeast portion of the town was ceded back to the town of Richmond, as it was inconvenient at that time for the highway department to go around the head of the lake to maintain the roads. The town line now crosses the center of the lake to the crossroad over the inlet of the lake. The town of Richmond was one of the first towns formed from Ontario County, which was called the Mother County, as several other counties were formed from Ontario. In fact, I think there's 13 counties formed from Ontario County. Ontario County at one time extended south as far as the Pennsylvania line, west as far as the Niagara Falls, north as far as Lake Ontario, and east way beyond Seneca County. A lot of people don't realize that Lewiston, Monroe, Wayne, Yates were counties formed out of the mother county, Ontario. The records show that the first board meeting in the town was held in 1829. The Board of Supervisors meetings in Canandaigua met once in 3 months, sometimes less than that. As there were no automobiles at that time, the supervisor either rode on horseback or took the train to Canandaigua. The supervisor of our town was said to ride home to the town of Bristol supervisor and walk home from there, crossing the ice on Honeoye Lake at that time as a shortcut. The town had the population of near what it is in the town at the present time. And by the census in 1950, it was down to 300 people. People moved from the town to Rochester to work in industry where they could make a better living. Most of the people in the town were farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and hired help on the farms. The first settlers came to the town and settled at the head of Honeoye and Canadice lakes with wagons drawn by ox team. At one time, there were 5 passenger boats on Hemlock Lake and 5 hotels on the lake, and 100 cottages, history states. People came to Hemlock from Rochester on the railroad and stayed in a hotel in Hemlock and those on the lake. They would ride on the passenger boats. The first passenger boat, I think, was called Seth Green. It was made by a person in Buffalo. It was 40 foot long and 8 foot wide, carried 40 passengers. The last passenger boat on the lake was named Corabelle, which was owned by C.E. Wimet in Hemlock. That was sold to a person on Lake Ontario, Irondequoit. It was drawn from the lake, mounted on 2 farm wagons, drawn by a steam engine, down to be shipped by the railroad. There were several sawmills around Hemlock Lake, and the lumber of the railroad to be shipped to Rochester and other places. Many of the older buildings in Rochester were built from the lumber taken from down Hemlock Lake. Hemlock at one time was called Slab City. There are people in the audience that know that and vouch for what I am saying. A road from Hemlock to Lima was built with plank and was called the Plank Road, which is now a part of Route 15A. When the city of Rochester bought up the cottages around the land of Canadice Lake, some of the cottages were moved to Honeoye Lake. I remember when there were 3 cottages on Honeoye Lake and 2 on the east side. It was all farmland down to the lake shores and some wooded area. There's one, I'll tell you a little story about one of the homeowners and cottage owners at the head of the lake was named Leif Sullivan. He was born there and lived there all his life, and of course he did a lot of fishing. The conservation people caught him for catching illegal fish. He was taken down to Honeoye, to the town court in front of Herm Wood, who was the justice of peace at that time. Herm asked him if he pleaded guilty or innocent. Why, sure, he says, I'm guilty. He said, what's the fine? What's the damages? Let's get this over with. Well, the judge told him it will cost you $10. Pulled out his pocketbook and paid the $10. Now he said, Judge, I want to tell you something. I've lived on this lake all my life. I caught all the fish I wanted of any kind, anytime I wanted to, and I'm going to continue to do the same thing. You caught me this time, but try and catch me again. At least he was pretty honest. Canadice was one of the last towns formed from Ontario County, as the land, the southern part of the town, was swampy and infested with mosquitoes, causing many people to die with typhoid fever. One of the first settlers at the head of Hemlock Lake came from Livonia and walked across the lake on the ice to clear the land for building a home. Clearing the land with a certain number of brush piles entitled them to claim the land. Telephone lines around 1904 were built by a local telephone company called the Canadice Telephone Company. Several men in the town donated the poles and donated the poles and built the line. The company only purchased the wire and the phones. I remember the old phones were fastened to the wall and rung by turning a crank, causing the bells to ring. Each customer had a certain number of rings. Ours, I remember, was one long and two short. The mail came to the town from Canandaigua by a man on horseback to Dansville one day and back to Canandaigua the next day. I might say the first post office in the town was located in a house across from the Canadice Church. Later it was moved to Gold Cooks' store, which was on the opposite corner and across from the cemetery. I have a letter dated 1877 that was postmarked from Canadice Post Office. And I guess there aren't many of them around. The mail coming from Canandaigua on horseback one day and back the next, he would stop each way at Aunt Sal's Tavern at Canadice Corner for his lunch and maybe a 5-cent glass of whiskey. The town is now changed with only 3 or 4 farms left in the town that are worked. It's mostly residential town with permanent and summer homes in the hills and around the lake. Most of the people now drive to Rochester to work in industry. This is some of what I know about the town of Canadice. I could tell you a lot of stories about the people and about the town, but I wouldn't take up your time. There's others here to speak. One that I'd like to share with you. There was a gentleman named George Elkins lived in town. He was a retired professor from the university, and he developed a little drinking problem. There was forced from teaching. He boarded with Ed Hogan at Canadice Corners and worked on the road for J. Becker. There was times when they weren't working on the road, he worked for other people. He worked for me growing hay one day along with another younger fellow named Gene Huey, who lived at Canadice Corner. We were putting up, that was before the days of balers, putting up the hay with a horse fork. Neither one of them could drive a tractor, pulling the rope to pull the hay up. So I wound up driving a 1020 tractor, pulling up the hay. I had warned Eugene, he was setting the horse fork not to get the rope wander around his hands, thinking not much about his feet. But anyway, I'd gone out a little ways and pulled the horse fork full of hay up some distance and looked back, and there Gene was hanging by one foot with a trip rope around his feet.
It was really more than 1 foot, wasn't it?
So I proceeded to get off the tractor and back, and I had to raise him up a little to get the rope loose from his foot. And this made George Elkins up there mowing the hay a little nervous. Says, "Come on, Gene, send up the hay." He said, "The whole damn Mastin family hasn't got money enough to hire me to mow this damn stuff." I'd like to add a little bit to what Barbara said about the Crooks' store, and that being used, for the town board meetings. That was the town hall. Is that later years, the hall wasn't in too good a shape, and the county bought it for a sight distance corner, and then they moved over into the little schoolhouse, which is used for town hall and still is. I have a picture of my mother, the teacher there, and the list of the pupils. My mother went to school there in 1902. So you can see that's quite an old building. There's things that happen that we don't realize as time goes on. I remember while I was supervisor, what used to be the town highway building, and Clifford was on the board, and he knows what I'm talking about. That time they built a new highway building, and this one was not in very good shape. In fact, the roof started caving in like that and become a liability to the town. The town board discussed it and decided that we would get rid of it, and by getting the firemen to come up and burn it. So with that decision, they thought, well, perhaps we better check with the town attorney and see what he has to say. Well, the town attorney lived in Canandaigua at that time, Robert Himes, and he said, you better, I told him what we talked about doing, and he said, you better let me look into that a little bit. So about a week later, I went in there, and he said, you may get your fingers burnt. He said, burning that, he said, the town doesn't own that. That was quite a surprise. Who does own it? It's that Canadice Methodist Church. That's the parsonage lot. And the town got a 99-year lease from the church to build this highway building. It's on a foundation, and it said it belongs to the church. Well, of course, this is a surprise to us, and we checked with older folks, and nobody knew about it, Mr. Payne, and of course, if anybody knew, he would. Well, he didn't know, but I'll look up the church records, and he found in the church records, yes, this was the case. The town was to pay the church $4 a year for the rent of it. Well, as time went on, the supervisor was checked up by the state auditors, and said the church renting this can't be exempt from taxes on it because they're renting it. Well, for that, the best deal for the church was forget the $4. Wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. And that's the way that went along. There's many things in the town that are of interest, but other people would like to talk about the town and what take too much money. I want to thank everybody for your kind attention while I was talking. If you had any questions that I could answer, I'd be glad to answer for you. One over here.
How much was your first year's salary when you were teaching?
The first year's salary was $22 a week.
$22
My last year's salary in Honeoye was $40 a week.
a week. 50%, 100% raise, huh?
I think if we can hold the questions till the end, maybe we can finish our last speaker and then open it up to all questions, if that would be okay. So go ahead, Jack, and then we'll...
I'd like to add a little bit to what Barbara said about the Crooks' store, and that being used, for the town board meetings. That was the town hall. Is that later years, the hall wasn't in too good a shape, and the county bought it for a sight distance corner, and then they moved over into the little schoolhouse, which is used for town hall and still is. I have a picture of my mother, the teacher there, and the list of the pupils. My mother went to school there in 1902. So you can see that's quite an old building. There's things that happen that we don't realize as time goes on. I remember while I was supervisor, what used to be the town highway building, and Clifford was on the board and he knows what I'm talking about. That time they built a new highway building, and this one was not in very good shape. In fact, the roof started caving in like that and become a liability to the town. The town board discussed it and decided that we would get rid of it, and by getting the firemen to come up and burn it. So with that decision, they thought, well, perhaps we better check with the town attorney and see what he has to say. Well, the town attorney lived in Canandaigua at that time, Robert Himes, and he said, you better, I told him what we talked about doing, and he said, you better let me look into that a little bit. So about a week later, I went in there and he said, you may get your fingers burnt. He said, burning that, he said, the town doesn't own that. That was quite a surprise. Who does own it? Well, it's that Canadice Methodist Church. That's the parsonage lot. And the town got a 99-year lease from the church to build this highway building. It's on a foundation, and it said it belongs to the church. Well, of course, this is a surprise to us, and we checked with older folks, and nobody knew about it, Mr. Payne, and of course, if anybody knew, he would. Well, he didn't know, but I'll look up the church records, and he found in the church records, yes, this was the case. The town was to pay the church $4 a year for the rent of it. Well, as time went on, the supervisor was checked up by the state auditors and said the church renting this can't be exempt from taxes on it because they're renting it. Well, for that, the best deal for the church was forget the $4. So they wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. And that's the way that went along. There's many things in the town that are of interest, but other people would like to talk about the town and what take much noise. I want to thank everybody for your kind attention while I was talking. If you had any questions that I could answer, I'd be glad to answer for you. One over here.
How much was your first year's salary when you were teaching?
The first year's salary was $22 a week.
$22 a week.
My last year's salary in Honeoye was $40 a week.
50%, 100% raise, huh?
I think if we can hold the questions till the end, maybe we can finish our last speaker and then open it up to all questions, if that would be okay. So go ahead, Jack, and then we'll